The morning Detroit died started like any other Tuesday, except for the screaming. Marcus Riley had been awake for maybe 30 seconds when he heard Mrs. Patterson from apartment 3B absolutely losing it in the hallway, her voice hitting notes he didn't think the old lady had in her anymore. He rolled out of bed, still wearing yesterday's jeans because doing laundry in this building meant fighting 3 other tenants for a machine that barely worked, and stumbled toward his door. The screaming got louder, closer, more desperate, and then it just stopped in a way that made his stomach drop. Marcus wasn't what you'd call a hero, just a 26-year-old mechanic who was 3 months behind on rent and living on ramen and bad decisions, but something about that sudden silence made him grab the baseball bat he kept by the door, the one he'd bought after the break-ins last summer. He turned the deadbolt as quietly as possible and pressed his eye to the peephole, and what he saw made absolutely no sense at all. Mrs. Patterson was on the ground, and Mr. Kowalski from 3D was on top of her, but he was moving all wrong, jerky and twitchy like a puppet with tangled strings, and there was blood, way too much blood, spreading across the hallway's stained carpet in a dark pool that kept growing. Marcus's brain tried to make it make sense, tried to tell him this was some kind of medical emergency, a seizure maybe, but then Mr. Kowalski lifted his head and his jaw was working up and down, chewing on something that made Marcus's breakfast threaten to come back up. The thing that used to be Mr. Kowalski turned its head toward Marcus's door, and even through the fisheye distortion of the peephole, Marcus could see that the old man's eyes were completely wrong, clouded over like milk left out too long, and there was something that definitely wasn't leftover pizza sauce dripping down his chin. Marcus backed away from the door so fast he nearly tripped over his own sneakers, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to break out and run away without him. His phone was buzzing on the nightstand, vibrating itself nearly to the edge, and he grabbed it with shaking hands to see 17 missed calls from his sister Shanice, 3 from his boy Tommy, and a dozen text messages that all basically said the same thing in increasingly frantic variations of stay inside and don't trust nobody and this is really happening. The last message from Shanice just said I'm coming to get you, don't be stupid, which was pretty rich coming from her, considering she'd once tried to break up a dog fight with her bare hands, but Marcus had never been more grateful for his bossy older sister in his entire life. He pulled up the news on his phone and every channel was showing the same nightmare, aerial shots of the city with smoke rising from at least a dozen different locations, crowds of people running through the streets while other crowds chased them with that same horrible jerky movement he'd seen through the peephole, reporters trying to keep it together while their voices cracked and failed. The power went out about 20 minutes later, which Marcus figured was probably the city's electrical workers either fleeing for their lives or becoming part of the problem, and suddenly his apartment was darker than it should be at 8 in the morning because his windows faced an alley that never saw direct sunlight anyway. He used his phone's flashlight to navigate to his kitchen, trying to remember every zombie movie he'd ever half-watched while drunk or high, trying to pull something useful from all that fiction that might apply to whatever this situation actually was. The bat felt inadequate suddenly, like bringing a knife to a gunfight except somehow even worse, so he started pulling together anything that might work as a weapon or a tool, his camping backpack from the closet where it had been gathering dust since that one time he'd promised himself he'd get outdoors more, a couple of water bottles he filled from the tap while it still worked, the beef jerky and granola bars from his sad bachelor pantry, and the emergency radio his mom had given him last Christmas that he'd never bothered to unpack. He was shoving batteries into the radio when he heard the apartment door across from his splinter open with a crash that made him jump so hard he dropped the radio, and then there were footsteps in the hall, multiple sets, moving with that shuffling scraping sound that he was already learning to recognize as very bad news. Someone started pounding on Marcus's door, heavy rhythmic thuds that made the whole frame shake, and for a second his brain screamed that it was them, that the infected or the zombies or whatever they were had somehow known he was in here, but then a voice cut through the pounding. "Marcus, man, I know you're in there, open up." It was Tommy, his voice pitched high with panic, and Marcus practically threw himself at the door, yanking it open to find his best friend since middle school standing there with blood on his shirt and wild terror in his eyes, and behind him was Jade Martinez from the corner store, the one who always gave them free coffee when their shift started too early, and some white kid Marcus didn't recognize who couldn't have been more than 19 and looked about 2 seconds from completely losing it. Marcus grabbed Tommy's arm and hauled all three of them inside, slamming the door and throwing the deadbolt, the chain, and for good measure shoving his dresser in front of it while Tommy leaned against the wall trying to catch his breath. "It's everywhere, man," Tommy gasped out between gulps of air. "The whole city's going completely insane. People are eating each other. Literal eating. I saw Jenkins from the shop, you know, Big Jenkins with the Pistons tattoo. I saw him take a chunk out of somebody's neck like it was a chicken wing." Jade was crying silently, tears running down her face while she clutched a baseball bat that matched Marcus's, and the kid was just staring at nothing, his eyes glazed and distant in a way that suggested he'd seen something that had broken something important inside his head. Marcus made them all sit down, made them drink water even though his supplies were already looking pathetic spread out between 4 people instead of 1, and tried to get the story straight. Tommy had been heading to work at the auto shop when the streets had just erupted into chaos, people running and screaming while others pursued them with single-minded hunger, and he'd seen at least 5 people get pulled down and torn apart before he'd had the sense to run. Jade had been opening the store when a customer she'd known for years, Mrs. Chen, who always bought the same lottery numbers, had come at her with teeth bared and hands grasping, and Jade had barely made it back inside and locked the door before the woman had started throwing herself against the glass hard enough to crack it. The kid, who finally introduced himself as Kyle and said he was a sophomore at Wayne State, had watched his roommate die and come back in the space of maybe 10 minutes, had seen the bite on his arm turn black and spreading like time-lapse footage of rot, had seen his eyes cloud over and his personality just evaporate like it had never existed at all. The emergency radio crackled to life with an automated voice that sounded almost bored as it delivered the end of the world. "This is the emergency alert system. A state of emergency has been declared for Wayne County and surrounding areas. Citizens are advised to shelter in place, secure all entrances, and avoid contact with infected individuals. Military personnel are being deployed. Do not attempt to rescue infected family members. Repeat, do not approach anyone displaying aggressive behavior or signs of infection. Further instructions will follow." The message looped 3 times and then dissolved into static, and the 4 of them sat there in Marcus's crappy apartment listening to white noise and the occasional scream from somewhere outside, trying to process that their entire reality had shifted into something unrecognizable in the space of a few hours. Shanice called again and Marcus nearly dropped the phone in his rush to answer, relief flooding through him at the sound of her voice even though she was clearly driving too fast and swearing creatively at other drivers. "I'm 10 minutes out, baby brother, you better be ready to move because we are not staying in that death trap you call an apartment building," she said, and Marcus could hear her kids crying in the background, his niece Destiny and nephew Caleb, which meant she'd pulled them out of school, and this was even more real than it had been 30 seconds ago. Marcus told her about Tommy and the others, and he could practically hear Shanice doing the math, calculating space and resources and risk in that way she'd perfected as a single mom working 2 jobs to keep her kids fed. "Fine, but everyone better be ready to pull their weight, and if anyone's bit, they're not getting in my car. I don't care if that makes me heartless," she said, and Marcus didn't argue because he'd seen what Kyle had described, had heard the timing of it, and he wasn't about to risk his sister or his niece and nephew for anyone. He told the others they had maybe 8 minutes to get ready, to grab anything useful, to prepare to move fast, and Tommy immediately went to Marcus's kitchen and started loading food into a garbage bag while Jade tested the weight of her bat with the grim determination of someone who'd already accepted she'd have to use it. Kyle still looked shell-shocked, but he managed to pull himself together enough to ask if Marcus had any other weapons, and Marcus remembered the toolbox under his sink, the hammer and the screwdrivers and the utility knife that suddenly looked a lot more practical than they had when he was just using them to fix his perpetually broken cabinets. He distributed tools like they were treasure, gave Tommy the hammer because his boy was built like a linebacker and could probably do some serious damage, gave Kyle the biggest screwdriver because it was better than nothing, kept the utility knife for himself and tucked the bat through a loop on his backpack. Shanice called again when she was 2 minutes out and told them to get to the street, that she wasn't stopping, just slowing down, and they'd have to jump in while she was still rolling because there was a pack of infected following some poor family about 3 blocks back and she didn't want to be stationary when they caught up. Marcus took one last look at his apartment, at the life he'd been living just a few hours ago that had seemed so important with its problems of rent and bills and whether to text back that girl from the bar, and it all felt incredibly stupid now, like worrying about the color of the curtains while the house burned down. They moved into the hallway as a group, staying tight, weapons ready, and the smell hit Marcus immediately, copper and rot and something else, something sweet and wrong that made his gag reflex trigger. Mrs. Patterson was still in the hallway but she was moving now, crawling toward them with half her throat missing and making a sound like a garbage disposal full of wet meat, and Marcus didn't think, just swung the bat and connected with her skull with a crack that he knew would haunt whatever dreams he managed to have for the rest of his life. She dropped and didn't get back up, and Tommy made a sound that might have been a prayer or might have been a curse, and they kept moving because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant breaking down. The stairwell was a nightmare, dim and echoing with sounds from both above and below, shuffling and moaning and the occasional scream that cut off too quickly. They made it down 2 flights before running into Mr. Kowalski coming up, and this time Marcus didn't hesitate, didn't let himself think about the old man who'd always slipped him $20 at Christmas, just saw the threat and eliminated it with 2 hard swings that left his arms vibrating and his stomach churning. Jade took out the next one, some teenager Marcus vaguely recognized from the building, and she was crying while she did it but her swing was solid, and Marcus realized they were all going to have to become people they'd never imagined being if they wanted to survive this. They burst out of the building's front entrance into a world that had completely fallen apart, cars abandoned in the middle of the street, some still running with doors hanging open, a corner store on fire sending black smoke into a sky that seemed too blue and normal for the horror happening beneath it, and bodies everywhere, some still, some twitching, some standing up with that horrible jerky movement and turning milky eyes toward fresh prey. Shanice's SUV came around the corner going maybe 40 in a 25 zone, and Marcus had never been so happy to see his sister's beat-up Explorer in his entire life. They ran for it, all 4 of them, while infected peeled off from other pursuits and started shambling their direction, and Marcus discovered he could run a lot faster than he'd ever managed in high school gym class when the motivation was not becoming someone's lunch. Tommy reached the SUV first and yanked the back door open, practically throwing himself inside, and Jade was right behind him while Kyle stumbled and nearly went down before Marcus grabbed his jacket and hauled him forward with strength he didn't know he had. Marcus dove into the back seat last and was still pulling the door shut when Shanice hit the gas, and his door slammed closed from the momentum as they fishtailed down the street, clipping a fire hydrant that exploded in a geyser of water that would have been cool under different circumstances. "Everyone okay? Anyone bit? Tell me now because I will put you out on this street without a second thought," Shanice said, her eyes meeting Marcus's in the rearview mirror, and he saw that she meant it absolutely, that she'd already made the hard calculations about what it took to keep her baby safe. They all checked themselves and each other, found scrapes and bruises but no bites, no scratches that looked infected, nothing that suggested they were on the clock toward becoming monsters. Destiny was 7 and Caleb was 5, and they were both crying in their car seats with the kind of fear that kids shouldn't have to experience, the kind that Marcus knew would mark them forever, assuming they lived long enough for forever to matter. Shanice had always been the strong one, the one who'd raised Marcus after their mom died and their dad checked out into a bottle, the one who'd made something of herself despite everything trying to drag her down, and she was using every bit of that strength now as she navigated streets clogged with abandoned cars and running people and infected that threw themselves at moving vehicles with no sense of self-preservation. "Where are we going?" Tommy asked, and it was a valid question because heading deeper into the city seemed like a terrible idea but heading out meant highways that were probably parking lots of stalled traffic and desperate people. Shanice had apparently already thought this through, had probably been planning since the first news report while Marcus was still trying to process reality. "Dad's cabin," she said, and Marcus felt his stomach sink because their dad's cabin meant their dad, meant Jackson Riley, who'd been more ghost than father for the last decade, who lived 2 hours north in the middle of nowhere because he couldn't handle being around people after Mom died. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to suggest literally anywhere else, but the truth was the cabin made sense in a way that most places didn't. It was remote, defensible, had its own well and solar panels because their dad had gone full survivalist hermit, and if they could actually make it there, they'd have a real chance of riding out whatever this was until the military or the government or somebody got things under control. Jade spoke up from the back seat, her voice steadier now. "My mom and my abuela live in Dearborn, we have to get them," and it wasn't a question or a request but a statement of fact, a line she was drawing. Marcus looked at Shanice and saw her jaw tighten, saw her doing that mental math again, but she nodded shortly because Shanice understood family, understood that some things you didn't negotiate. Kyle raised his hand like he was still in class, which would have been funny if everything wasn't so horrible. "I don't have anyone," he said quietly. "My roommate was it. My parents are in Oregon. So wherever you guys are going, if you'll let me tag along, I'll do whatever you need." Tommy clapped the kid on the shoulder, and Marcus felt a weird surge of something almost like hope, because if they were collecting strays and making plans, that meant they thought there was a future worth planning for. Getting to Dearborn meant crossing half the city, and Shanice drove like she was in a video game, mounting curbs and taking corners at speeds that had the SUV tilting on 2 wheels while Destiny and Caleb screamed and Marcus prayed to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. They saw horrors on that drive, things that would be burned into Marcus's memory forever: a cop trying to direct traffic while infected streamed toward him and pulled him down, a family trapped on top of their minivan while dozens of the dead surrounded them with upraised arms and gnashing teeth, a man who'd barricaded himself in a bus shelter and was methodically taking out infected one by one with a golf club until the sheer numbers overwhelmed him. Tommy kept saying we should help them about every group of survivors they passed, and every time Shanice said we can't save everyone in a voice that got harder and flatter until Tommy stopped suggesting it. Marcus understood both sides, understood Tommy's need to do something good in all this horror and Shanice's cold calculation that stopping meant dying, and he was grateful he wasn't the one who had to make the call. Jade directed them through side streets she knew from growing up in this neighborhood, away from the main drags that were completely clogged, through residential areas where people watched from windows or didn't watch at all because they were already dead or already fled. They had to stop twice to clear abandoned cars blocking their path, and those stops were exercises in pure terror, everyone jumping out with weapons ready while infected that had been out of sight suddenly appeared and shambled toward them with awful determination. The first stop, Marcus and Tommy worked together to push a Civic out of the way while Shanice revved the engine and Jade and Kyle stood guard, and they almost made it clean before an infected in a business suit came around a corner and grabbed at Kyle. The kid froze completely, and it was Jade who saved him, her back coming around in an arc that took the thing's head nearly off, and Kyle threw up in the gutter while they finished clearing the path. The second stop was worse because there were more of them, at least 7 or 8 infected converging from different directions, and Marcus found himself fighting in a way he'd never imagined, pure survival instinct, the bat rising and falling until his arms burned and the thing in front of him stopped moving. Jade's family home was a small brick bungalow with a chain-link fence and a Virgin Mary statue in the front yard, and the fence was holding back maybe a dozen infected who'd apparently figured out that there were living people inside but hadn't figured out how to work the gate latch. Shanice pulled up right against the fence and laid on the horn, a long blast that drew every infected head in their direction, and Marcus saw the curtain move in the front window, saw a face peek out. "We need to draw them off," Tommy said, and before anyone could stop him, he'd opened his door and was yelling and waving his arms, and the infected turned toward this new easier prey and started moving away from the gate. Jade was already out and running for the house, screaming for her mom in Spanish and English, and the front door opened and 2 women emerged, one middle-aged and moving fast, one elderly and moving slower, and Marcus's heart was in his throat because the infected were figuring out that Tommy was inside a vehicle and starting to turn back toward the easier targets. Kyle did something brave then, something that suggested maybe he had more spine than Marcus had given him credit for, jumping out and joining Tommy and making noise and drawing attention while Jade and her family ran for the SUV. They got everyone loaded, Jade's mom clutching a bag and her abuela holding a Bible and a framed photo, and Shanice was already moving before all the doors were closed, accelerating away from grasping hands and snapping teeth with maybe inches to spare. The SUV was packed now, 9 people in a vehicle meant for 7, but nobody complained because the alternative was being left behind to die or worse. Jade was crying and holding her mom and grandmother, all 3 of them speaking rapid Spanish that Marcus couldn't follow, and he gave them space for their reunion because family was the only thing that mattered now, the only thing worth fighting for. Shanice pointed them north, toward the highway, toward the cabin, and they all knew the hardest part was still ahead because getting out of Detroit was going to be nearly impossible if the roads were as bad as they feared. The entrance ramp to I-75 confirmed their worst fears, cars backed up as far as they could see, completely stationary, some abandoned and some still occupied by people who were either too stubborn or too scared to leave their vehicles, and weaving between them were infected, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, attracted by the concentration of prey. Shanice didn't even slow down, just mounted the median and started driving north in the southbound lanes, wrong way in an apocalypse, and it should have been terrifying but the southbound side was almost empty because who was trying to get into Detroit today? They made it maybe 5 miles at high speed, the city falling away behind them, and Marcus was starting to think they might actually pull this off when they came around a curve and found a military checkpoint set up across all lanes, Humvees and concrete barriers and soldiers in full gear pointing weapons at their approaching vehicle. Shanice slowed and stopped because you didn't play chicken with the army, and a sergeant approached with his rifle raised, signaling for her to roll down her window. "Checkpoint's closed, ma'am." "No one's leaving the quarantine zone," he said, and his voice was tired and stressed but firm, and Marcus felt his hope crumble because of course the government wasn't going to let people just leave, wasn't going to risk the infection spreading. Shanice argued, showed him the kids in the back seat, explained they weren't infected, and the sergeant's eyes were sympathetic but his answer didn't change. "I got my orders. No one passes. Turn your vehicle around and proceed to the nearest designated safe zone for processing." Marcus looked back the way they'd come and saw smoke rising from multiple points in the city, heard the distant pop of gunfire and screams, and he knew with absolute certainty that going back was death, that there were no safe zones, that this was every person for themselves and the government had already lost control even if they didn't know it yet. Tommy saw it too, leaned forward and said quietly, "Shanice, we can't go back," and she nodded once, her hands tight on the wheel. What happened next happened fast. Shanice suddenly screamed and pointed past the sergeant, yelling, "Oh my God, they're right behind you," and when the soldier instinctively turned to look, she punched the gas. The SUV leaped forward, clipping the sergeant and sending him spinning, smashing through the gap between 2 barriers that wasn't quite wide enough, scraping paint and metal on both sides with a shriek that set Marcus's teeth on edge, and then they were through, accelerating away while shouts erupted behind them and Marcus prayed they wouldn't shoot, that whoever was in charge wouldn't give that order. Shots did ring out but they were aimed high, warning shots, and then the checkpoint was behind them and they were flying north on an empty highway under a perfect blue sky while Jade's abuela prayed in Spanish and Destiny asked why that man was mad at them. They drove for an hour without seeing another living soul, just abandoned cars scattered like dropped toys and a few infected wandering aimlessly who turned and shambled toward the road when they heard the engine. The gas gauge was showing half empty when they passed through a small town that looked like everyone had just evaporated, doors standing open and traffic lights cycling through their patterns for no one. Shanice made the call to stop for supplies, to hit a gas station and whatever stores they could access quickly, and they rolled into a marathon station with the cautious of people who'd learned that anywhere could be dangerous. Tommy and Marcus cleared the station, found it empty except for one infected in the bathroom who'd apparently been an employee based on the name tag that said Travis, and Marcus put him down with the bat while trying not to think about how Travis had probably come to work that morning worried about normal things like his schedule or what to have for lunch. They filled the SUV and every container they could find that would hold gas, while Jade and her mom raided the attached convenience store, loading up on water and chips and beef jerky and anything with calories that wouldn't spoil immediately. Kyle found a hunting shop 3 doors down and came back with a crowbar and a real hunting knife, plus a compound bow and a quiver of arrows that he admitted he had no idea how to use but figured he could learn. Tommy discovered a pharmacy and grabbed first aid supplies, antibiotics, painkillers, anything that seemed useful, and Marcus was helping him load bags into the SUV when he heard the engines. 3 motorcycles came around the corner moving fast, and the riders were very much alive, very much not infected, and very much trouble based on the guns they were carrying and the way they spread out to block the road. The lead rider killed his engine and pulled off his helmet, revealing a white guy maybe 40 years old with a shaved head and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well now, looks like you folks are doing pretty well for yourselves," he said, his eyes tracking over their loaded vehicle and the supplies still being carried out. "Thing is, we've claimed this territory, so anything you take from here, you're really taking from us, and we're gonna need compensation for that." Shanice stepped forward and Marcus wanted to pull her back but knew better than to undermine his sister when she was in negotiation mode. "We don't want trouble. We're just passing through, taking what we need to survive," she said, her voice calm and reasonable, but Marcus could see her hand sliding toward the small of her back where he knew she kept the pistol she'd bought after her ex started making threats about custody. The bald man's smile got wider and meaner. "See, everybody's just trying to survive, sweetheart. But some of us are smart enough to know the old rules don't apply anymore. So here's how this works. You leave the vehicle, leave the supplies, and maybe we let you walk away." His buddies laughed and revved their engines, and Marcus saw they were carrying baseball bats studded with nails and at least 1 shotgun, and he did the math and didn't like the answer. Tommy sidled up next to him and whispered, "I count 3 of them, 7 of us if you count Jade's mom, plus we got the element of surprise if we move fast," but Marcus shook his head slightly because he could also count the children in the vehicle who could get caught in crossfire. The standoff might have gone bad except that's when the infected arrived, drawn by the noise of the motorcycles and the voices, shambling out from between buildings and around corners, maybe 20 of them in total. The biker gang saw them and the bald man swore creatively, and suddenly everyone's priorities shifted because the dead didn't care about territory or supplies or tough guy posturing. "Truce until these things are handled," the bald man barked, and Shanice nodded shortly, and for 3 minutes it was absolute chaos, 9 living humans fighting back to back against 20 dead ones, and Marcus learned he could fight even when exhausted, even when terrified, even when every muscle screamed for rest. The bikers were brutal and efficient, clearly not their first time dealing with infected, and Marcus watched the shotgun blast the skull off one zombie and then get reversed to club another, watched the studded bats pulverize heads with practiced efficiency. When it was over and all 20 infected were down and not getting back up, both groups stood there breathing hard and covered in blood and other fluids, and the bald man looked at Shanice with something almost like respect. "You all handle yourselves pretty well," he admitted. "Tell you what, keep your supplies, get out of our territory, and we'll call it even for the assist." Shanice didn't argue, just got everyone loaded up while the bikers watched, and they pulled out heading north again with Marcus's heart still hammering from the adrenaline. "We just got lucky," Jade said quietly from the back. "Next group we run into might not be willing to deal." She was right and everyone knew it, knew that the infection was only one threat in a world where civilization was collapsing, where desperate people would do desperate things, where the strong would prey on the weak unless the weak got smart and strong themselves. The cabin couldn't come fast enough, and when Shanice's phone GPS went out because cell towers were failing, they had to navigate by road signs and Marcus's vague memory of childhood trips he'd mostly spent sleeping or complaining. They turned off the highway onto state roads, then county roads, then dirt roads that wound through forests that were just starting to show fall colors, nature completely indifferent to humanity's crisis. The sun was setting when they finally saw the turnoff, an unmarked trail that Shanice nearly missed, and then they were bouncing down a rutted path that hadn't seen maintenance in years, branches scraping the SUV's sides, and Marcus was half convinced they'd gotten lost until the cabin appeared in a clearing. It wasn't much to look at, a two-room structure of weathered wood with a tin roof and a covered porch, solar panels glinting on the roof and a satellite dish that was probably how their dad kept up with the outside world in his self-imposed isolation. The lights were on inside, and smoke was rising from the chimney, which meant Jackson Riley was home, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten with complicated emotions he didn't have time to process. They parked and approached cautiously, weapons ready because paranoid hermits with guns were unpredictable even before the apocalypse, and Marcus called out, "Dad?" "It's Marcus and Shanice. We're coming in, don't shoot." The cabin door opened and their father appeared, and Marcus was shocked by how old he looked, how much older than his 53 years, gray and weathered like the cabin itself, but his eyes were sharp and the hunting rifle in his hands was steady and pointed right at them. "Check them for bites," was all he said. No greeting, no surprise, just immediate practicality, and that was Jackson Riley in a nutshell, all survival and no sentiment. They submitted to inspection, everyone showing skin and proving they were clean, and only then did Jackson lower the rifle and step back to let them enter. The cabin's interior was sparse but functional, a wood stove providing heat, a hand-pumped sink, shelves lined with canned goods and supplies that Jackson had apparently been stockpiling for exactly this kind of scenario, and Marcus felt a weird gratitude for his father's paranoid preparation even as he resented needing it. Jackson listened to their story without comment, his face unreadable, and when Shanice finished he just nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd already figured out. "Saw it coming on the news this morning. Government lost control faster than I expected, but the outcome was inevitable. System was too fragile, too dependent on everything working perfectly." He started pulling supplies off shelves, distributing them with the efficiency of a drill sergeant. "You can stay, but everyone pulls their weight. No dead weight, no passengers. Kids are exempt until they're old enough to help, but every adult works. We hunt, we fortify, we survive. Clear?" Everyone nodded because arguing with Jackson when he was in command mode was pointless, and honestly his rules made sense in a world that had stopped making sense. They fell into an exhausted routine that first night, eating canned stew heated on the wood stove, spreading out sleeping bags and blankets in every available space, and Marcus found himself lying awake listening to the forest sounds outside and wondering if infected could track them this far from the city. Kyle was on the floor next to him, also clearly awake, and he whispered, "Thank you for not leaving me behind. Multiple times today you could have cut me loose and you didn't." Marcus didn't know what to say to that, settled for "We're all in this together now, man. Family isn't just blood anymore." He heard Kyle's breathing hitch like maybe he was crying silently, and Marcus stared at the ceiling and thought about how the world had ended and somehow he'd survived the first day, they'd all survived. And tomorrow they'd have to figure out how to survive the next day and the day after that and however many days it took for this nightmare to end or for them to accept it never would. The first week at the cabin was brutal as they adjusted to a new reality that had no room for weakness or hesitation. Jackson ran the place like a military camp, everyone up at dawn, duties assigned and rotated, constant work on fortification and preparation. Marcus and Tommy spent days digging a trench around the cabin's perimeter and sharpening stakes to plant in it, medieval defenses for a medieval nightmare. Jade and her mom organized supplies, created inventory systems, rationed food to make it stretch as far as possible. Kyle surprised everyone by actually figuring out the compound bow, practicing until his fingers bled and then practicing more, and by day 5 he could hit a target at 30 yards more often than not. Shanice homeschooled Destiny and Caleb as best she could, trying to maintain some normalcy for kids who'd watched the world end, and Jackson maintained the solar panels and the well and the radio equipment he used to monitor emergency broadcasts that became increasingly rare and desperate. The news, when they could get it, was uniformly bad. The infection had spread faster than anyone predicted, overwhelming military responses in major cities, jumping state lines and then international borders, and the government communications went from situation under control to shelter in place to radio silence in the space of 4 days. They saw their first infected in the woods on day 8, a lone shambler who'd apparently wandered miles from the nearest town, and Jackson took it down with a single rifle shot from the porch, then made Marcus and Tommy drag the body a quarter mile away and burn it because leaving infected corpses near the cabin was asking for scavengers and disease. That first one was followed by others, never more than one or two at a time, stragglers who'd somehow made it into the deep woods, and they developed a system, silent kills when possible to avoid drawing more, and a rotation of watch duties so someone was always alert. The solar panels meant they had limited electricity, enough for lights and the radio in Jackson's ancient laptop that he used to try to access whatever internet still existed, and what they found was a world in complete collapse, videos of cities burning, reports of safe zones being overrun, conspiracy theories and end times preaching and increasingly desperate pleas for help that would never come. Jade's abuela said it was the rapture, that the dead rising was prophesied, and she prayed constantly, which Jade found annoying and Marcus found oddly comforting even though he didn't share the faith, because at least someone still believed there was a plan, a purpose, even if that plan was the end of everything. Day 15 brought their first real test, the sound of an engine echoing through the forest, and they scrambled to positions they'd practiced, weapons ready, as a pickup truck came bumping down their trail. The truck stopped at the edge of the clearing and 3 people got out slowly, hands visible, no weapons drawn, a black woman maybe 30 years old, a Hispanic man about the same age, and a white teenage girl who looked half-starved and completely terrified. The woman called out, "We don't want trouble. We're just looking for a safe place, somewhere away from the cities. We can work, we have skills, we just need a chance." Jackson's rifle never wavered from his firing position inside the cabin window, and it was Shanice who made the call, stepping out onto the porch and saying, "Check for bites first, then we'll talk." The newcomers submitted to inspection, proving they were clean, and Marcus saw that their truck was nearly empty, that they'd clearly been traveling hard with minimal supplies, that they were at the end of their rope. The woman introduced herself as Angela, said she'd been a nurse before the world ended, that the man was Roberto and he'd been a carpenter, that the girl was Melissa and they'd found her hiding in a gas station 3 days ago, no family left, nowhere to go. Jackson wanted to turn them away, said every extra mouth was a strain on resources, but Jade argued that a nurse and a carpenter were exactly the kind of skills they needed, and Shanice backed her up, and eventually Jackson conceded with the same conditions as before: everyone works, no dead weight, first sign of infection and you're gone. Angela nearly cried with relief, and Roberto shook everyone's hands with the grip of someone who'd done hard labor his whole life, and Melissa just stood there looking lost until Destiny and Caleb approached her with the fearlessness of children and asked if she wanted to play cards, and something in the girl's face cracked open and she smiled for maybe the first time in weeks. They expanded the cabin's footprint, Roberto directing construction of 2 additional sleeping shanties using lumber they harvested from the forest, and Angela set up a proper medical station with supplies they'd brought and supplies from Jackson's stockpile, and Marcus found himself falling into a routine that felt almost normal if you didn't think too hard about why they were doing it. Hunting parties went out every few days, Marcus and Tommy and Kyle moving through the forest with weapons and learned caution, bringing back deer and rabbit and once a wild turkey that Jade's mom turned into a feast that reminded everyone what they were surviving for. They saw infected on these hunts, more of them as time went on, like they were spreading even into remote areas, and they learned to move silently, to avoid when possible and kill efficiently when necessary, to never take chances because chances got you killed or worse. Marcus killed his 20th infected on day 32, a milestone he didn't celebrate, just another tally mark in a world where the dead walked and the living learned to be harder than they'd ever imagined. The radio brought news of survival compounds forming, warlords claiming territory, the military holding a few key installations but abandoning most civilians to fend for themselves, and foreign reports suggested the infection was global, that nowhere was untouched, that humanity had genuinely been brought to the edge of extinction by an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with or negotiated with or defeated through conventional means. Jackson had theories about the infection's origin, government bioweapon or terrorist attack or natural mutation, but Marcus didn't care about the why anymore, only the how to survive, how to protect the people he cared about, how to build something worth living for in the ruins of everything. Shanice organized lessons for the kids, reading and math and history, determined that Destiny and Caleb and Melissa would grow up educated even in this new world, and Marcus sometimes listened in and learned things he'd never bothered to pay attention to in school, when school had seemed boring instead of a luxury they'd lost forever. Day 45 brought the first snow, early for the season, and with it the realization that winter was coming and they weren't fully prepared. They scrambled to finish the fortifications, to stockpile firewood, to hunt and preserve meat while game was still moving, and Jackson drove them hard because he knew what northern Michigan winters were like, knew that cold and snow would bring their own challenges beyond the infected. The infected themselves seemed to slow down in the cold, their already sluggish movements becoming even more lethargic, and Marcus wondered if they'd freeze solid when real winter hit, if maybe the cold would solve the problem that humanity couldn't. Angela dismissed that hope, explained that whatever animated them didn't rely on normal biological processes, that they'd probably keep moving even frozen, just slower, and Marcus's hope deflated because of course it wouldn't be that easy, nothing was easy anymore. They celebrated Thanksgiving on day 53, a strange affair where they had genuine things to be grateful for, survival and shelter and community, but also profound losses to mourn, a whole world that had existed 8 weeks ago and was just gone. Jade's abuela led them in prayer, and even Jackson bowed his head, and they ate venison and roasted vegetables from the garden they'd frantically planted and somehow coaxed into producing before the freeze, and Destiny asked if things would ever go back to normal and none of the adults had a good answer. That night, sitting watch while others slept, Marcus looked up at stars undimmed by city lights and thought about how beautiful the world was when humans weren't polluting it, and how tragic that it took an apocalypse to see it clearly. Tommy joined him on watch, passing a bottle of whiskey from Jackson's supply, and they drank in silence. For a while before Tommy said, "You think this is it? This is just life now? Forever?" Marcus considered, watching his breath mist in the cold air. "I think we adapt. Like we've been doing. We learn to live in the world we've got instead of the one we lost. We fight when we have to, we hide when we can, we take care of each other, and we don't give up. That's all we can do." Day 60 brought a crisis. Jade's mom developed a fever and a cough, and Angela immediately quarantined her while everyone else panicked because they'd all seen how fast the infection could spread. But Angela was firm that this was just flu, just regular illness, that the infection didn't start with a fever but with a bite or fluid transfer. She was proven right over 3 days as Jade's mom recovered with rest and antibiotics, but the scare reminded them all how fragile their situation was, how a dozen different things could kill them beyond the infected, disease or injury or starvation or cold or simple bad luck. They tightened protocols, hygiene and food safety and watch rotations, and Jackson started training everyone in field medicine, how to clean wounds and set bones and recognize the difference between treatable illness and infection, because Angela couldn't be everywhere and knowledge needed to be distributed. Kyle excelled at this training, his pre-med coursework from before translating into genuine usefulness, and Marcus watched the kid who'd been shell-shocked and useless that first day transform into someone competent and confident, and felt pride like Kyle was a younger brother he'd helped raise. The winter settled in hard, snow piling up and temperatures dropping below zero, and the infected that still wandered the woods became frozen monuments to horror, ice forming in their hair and on their clothes, but still they moved, slower but no less dangerous. A group of 6 came through in a blizzard on day 72, and they had to fight in whiteout conditions, unable to see more than a few feet, swinging weapons at sounds and shapes, and Marcus took a hit from Tommy's bat when they got turned around in the chaos, stars exploding in his vision before Tommy realized and started apologizing frantically. They survived, but Marcus had a concussion that left him dizzy and nauseous for a week, and it reinforced how quickly things could go wrong, how they were always one mistake from disaster. Angela treated him with the seriousness of a hospital doctor even though her hospital was a cabin room with limited supplies, and he recovered and went back to duty and tried not to think about how close he'd come to being a friendly fire casualty in a war that had no sides, just survivors and dead. Christmas was subdued, decorations made from pine boughs and whatever they could craft, presents that were practical things like hand-knitted socks and sharpened knives and preserved food, and Destiny cried because she missed her friends and her school and her old life, and Shanice held her and cried too because what else could you do when a 7-year-old asked why this had happened and you had no answer? Jackson surprised everyone by producing a bottle of genuine bourbon he'd been saving and a harmonica he'd apparently played in some previous lifetime, and he played carols while they all sang with varying degrees of skill, and for one evening they were just people together instead of survivors, and it was the best gift any of them could have received. Roberto and Jade had been growing closer, Marcus had noticed, spending time together when duties allowed, and on Christmas they made it official, holding hands and asking Jackson to say some words over them in as close to a wedding as this new world allowed, and Jade's mom cried happy tears and her abuela blessed them, and Marcus thought about how life persisted even in impossible circumstances, how people still fell in love and made commitments and believed in futures. Day 90 was New Year's Eve, and they marked the turning of the year with a bonfire in the clearing, taking turns on watch so the fire didn't make them vulnerable, and they each shared what they hoped for in the year to come. Shanice hoped her kids would be safe and grow up strong. Jackson hoped they'd make it through winter with no casualties. Angela hoped they'd find or build something bigger, a real community that could preserve knowledge and civilization. Tommy hoped for a cure, for someone somewhere in some lab to figure out how to stop the infection. Kyle hoped to be worthy of the family that had adopted him. Jade hoped for her new marriage to Roberto to have time to grow. Melissa hoped to be useful, to contribute, to earn her place. And Marcus, when it came to his turn, said he hoped they'd remember how to be human, not just survive like animals but maintain their humanity, their compassion, the things that made them worth saving. They drank to that and watched the fire, and when midnight came they cheered and hugged and pretended they believed everything would be okay. The deep winter brought a strange peace, the infected rare because either the cold had slowed them to immobility or they'd migrated elsewhere, and the survivors fell into rhythms that felt sustainable if not comfortable. They improved their shelters, insulated against the cold, created systems for water and waste that worked even when everything froze. They told stories around the fire, their own histories and made-up tales, and Melissa revealed she'd been a writer, or wanted to be, and she started documenting everything, creating a record of the end of the world and what came after, and Marcus sometimes watched her write and thought about future generations if there were any, reading about this time and trying to understand what it had been like. Jackson opened up more than Marcus had ever seen, talking about his service in the army, about losing their mother and how it had broken something in him, and it wasn't an apology for years of absence but it was an explanation, and Marcus found he could accept that, could forgive if not forget, because holding grudges in the apocalypse seemed pointless. Day 120 brought the first real thaw, snow melting and revealing the winter's accumulated dead, infected that had frozen and fallen and now were exposed as pathetic corpses that still needed to be burned, and they spent a week in the grim work of cleaning the area around the cabin. Spring came slowly, tentatively, and with it the realization that they'd need to plant a serious garden if they wanted to eat in the fall, that hunting in stockpiles wouldn't sustain them forever. Roberto directed the garden project, clearing land and building raised beds and organizing planting schedules, and everyone contributed, even the kids, turning soil and planting seeds and learning about growing food in a world where grocery stores were graveyards. They went on supply runs to the nearest town, risky ventures that required planning and coordination, loading up on tools and seeds and anything useful from houses and stores that had been picked over by others but still had treasures if you looked carefully. These runs sometimes brought contact with other survivors, sometimes friendly and sometimes not, and they learned to assess threats quickly, to trade when beneficial and flee when necessary, and twice they had to fight off raiders who thought a group with kids would be easy prey and learned otherwise. Angela discovered she was pregnant on day 145, Roberto's child, conceived sometime in those early days when comfort and connection had been desperately needed, and the news brought mixed emotions, joy and terror combined. A baby in this world seemed like both a miracle and a tragedy, new life in the midst of so much death, and they all knew the pregnancy would make Angela vulnerable and the baby would be utterly dependent in an environment that punished weakness. But Jade's abuela declared it a blessing, a sign that God hadn't abandoned them, and Shanice immediately went into planning mode, organizing prenatal care and supplies in preparation for a birth that would happen without hospitals or backup. Marcus watched Angela and Roberto together, saw their hope and fear, and made a private vow that he'd do everything in his power to make sure that baby was born safe and had a chance to grow up, because if they couldn't protect the next generation then what was the point of survival? Day 180, 6 months since Detroit died, and they gathered to mark the milestone, to acknowledge how far they'd come and how much they'd changed. Marcus looked around at faces that had become family, blood and chosen, and thought about the mechanic he'd been when this started, worried about rent and hangovers and whether to text back a girl whose name he couldn't even remember now. That person seemed like a stranger, soft and naive and completely unprepared for reality, and Marcus didn't miss him even slightly. He'd become someone harder, more capable, someone who could make difficult choices and live with the consequences, someone who protected instead of needing protection. They all had. Shanice had always been strong, but now she was steel. Tommy had been a follower, but now he led hunting parties. Kyle had been a scared kid, but now he was a skilled fighter and medic. Jade had worked retail, but now she ran logistics that kept them fed. Even the kids had grown up faster than they should have, competent and aware in ways that broke Marcus's heart even as he was proud of them. The infected were still out there, would probably always be out there, and the world was still broken beyond any quick repair. But standing there with his family around a fire in a clearing they'd defended and improved and made theirs, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in months, something that might have been hope or might have been simple determination, the refusal to give up, to lie down, to let the dead have the final word. They'd adapted and they'd fought back and they'd survived, and tomorrow they'd do it again, and the day after that, and however many days it took to build something worth having in the ruins of what was lost. The world had ended, but they hadn't, and as long as they were breathing and fighting and refusing to quit, then humanity had a chance, small and fragile but real. Marcus raised his cup in a toast, and the others joined him, and he said simply, to us, to survival, to the future we're going to build, and they drank together and believed it, because belief was a choice, and they chose to believe that their story wasn't over, that the best chapters might still be ahead, that the world that was lost could give birth to a world worth living in if they just had the courage to keep fighting for it.